Hi everyone, got a puffin today, so it's a lovely one with some daisy type flowers on there as well. It's a nice interesting draw. I've gone a little bit bigger with the puffin. I've started with a circular guide mark for the head, and then I've worked in that white ovally shape and then the beak first, and then I've worked around to make the dark shape. So concentrate in shapes and then brought the front white of the body in very loosely where the feet are and the wings at the back. Then I've just popped in the rock shapes and a little guide as to where the daisies are. I've actually popped masking fluid on the daisies. For the first time ever, I think my masking fluid is virtually going off. I don't think I've ever had a pot that I've not used when I've used it all in class with you all. So it'll be interesting to see if it comes off, because it's gone very thick. Colours wise, keeping it nice and simple again. I've got a bit of burnt sienna. So this is a turquoise. I'm using cobalt turquoise, which you probably won't have. You could use cerulean blue. You could use intense blue watered down. You could use turquoise if you've got it in student quality. Any light blue will do the job. I've got a light grey which is made with cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Cobalt blue on its own. Then I've got these three colours neat. So I have got transparent orange. You might not have that. You might have cadmium orange if you've got that. If you haven't got that, you want a mixture of permanent rose and gamboge to make an orange nice and thick. I've got Payne's grey. If you haven't got Payne's grey, then you want ultramarine and burnt sienna mixed together to make a nice dark black. And then I've got sepia. Okay, so you want to pop your masking fluid on in daisy like shapes. It sort of looks quite spidery, so I hope it's going to work. And then we're going to come on with some water and get a background on in here. So I'm coming over the daisies, to the rocks and around the puffin. So we're just concentrating on what I'm going to make like a sky background. I've covered the whole of the daisy, as in the head and the white petals, just to make it easier when you're bringing the colour on now. So make sure you've got plenty of water. Nice clean brush. So I'm going to dip into some cobalt blue first of all. This is a nice loose background, so you don't need to worry too much about what's happening. It can be nice and wet. You just want colour. If you fancy putting any other colours in, you can do as well. This should be a nice fun one to do. Not too taxing. Just making sure that I'm getting round the beak area, so that I'm getting those nice lines happening. So you don't need the blue everywhere, but you can use this cobalt blue as your base to get round and make sure you're getting those nice edges, especially around the puffin. my brush a bit of a rinse, then I'm dabbing into this turquoise colour. So whatever you have, you can take on. You can leave odd patches of white as well, that works really nicely. This isn't too strong. So just dabbing in. And give my brush another rinse. And we're coming into some of the light grey. If you think carefully about where you're putting it, you don't want too much of this on. But what's quite good is if you've got a bit behind, say, the white flowers, because that's going to help them stand out a little bit. And then the other thing you've got to be careful of is you don't end up, when you've come in with a cobalt blue, just having a halo of blue all the way around the puffin. So you've got to try and get a couple of bits of the other colours in to stop that sort of halo effect. Again, if you think about the white of the front of the puffin and getting something darker behind it, that'll work to contrast and help it stand out. So I'm going to pop a bit in here. Because it's wet, it should just flow and you shouldn't have to do too much effort wise. It's one of those ones where you can just let it do its thing really. You can tip it a little bit to help it run. You can have some nice effects. I'm just going to let that settle a minute and then I'll dry that one off. Okay? Okay, so I've dried that off now. I'm going to come on to the rocks now. So I'm coming round the puffin and just wetting the rocks. Around the puffin's feet. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of cobalt blue in first. So a few mixes of colours in here. Just want that hint of blue to start with. I'm going to take a hint of burnt sienna in. Just underneath where the bird is. And then I just want to put a few sort of random dabs in places. I'm just going to take a tiny bit of the turquoise in, just in a few dabs in places as well. And then I'm coming in with the grey. Now you don't have to get this everywhere. We're going to put some salt on. So that's going to give a little bit of a rock type effect. But as a rule, if you think you want a little bit more grey on than you, because it's going to take it away, that's what you're aiming for. The trick is it's got to be wet enough for the salt to take, so you can't dawdle too much. At this stage. Now, just very quickly into that burnt sienna. I'm going to take a bit of intense blue because I want to make a green and a nice natural looking green. And I won't need that burnt sienna again. So it's gone a bit tiny bit bluey. Take a bit more burnt sienna in. Okay, so I've got a nice natural looking green there, and what I just want to do is just pop some of it on so that I'm starting to get a little bit of a base of where this green's going to go. So you can take a little bit round where the daisies are. You don't have to get everything in, but it is quite helpful to start to get a bit of a base appearing. So I can just run through, start to create some of the dry bits of the daisies coming through. This will feel like there's quite a lot in this section for you to work on, but it is possible. And it's quite good that you do it quick. So I'm just wiggling my brush at the bottom just to create some little bits, and then I'm going to come this side just because the camera's in the way, and just, this is still with my round number 10, just going to bring this paint out just to start to create this grassier bit. Okay, I'm going to pop a sprinkle of salt on. Actually got the salt pot from the kitchen. Remember, keep it quite light, you don't want to put loads on. What you want is that rock texture effect. You can take a little bit over where you've got the green areas, it doesn't matter, we can work into those later anyway. And then it should start to pull some of the paint out. The other thing that you want is a little bit of plastic credit card, and whilst it's still wet I want you to start to draw in or just slightly indent the paper with some craggy rock effects. So I'm just putting a light bit of pressure on, and just that's drawing those lines where the rocks are. Just whilst it's still wet. It's going to save you some time later on. Because you're on a time limit, this is quite good because it's just making you look at it and just doing an impression of, rather than spend a lot of time trying to get it exact. So you're going to get a nice fluid line. Indent there. Got some nice indentation there. I'm going to pick up a round number 6 and pop in the water and a bit of sepia. So this is quite thick. I'm just popping it on in places. So it's going to run into those indentations and start to create that craggy effect. This bit, it tends to not matter if it's drying, because it actually works quite well for rocks if it's drying. And then I'm going to do the same with the Payne's grey. So wet brush, dabbed into the thick colour. Payne's grey does shoot a little bit more, which will work quite nicely. Giving in, and again I'm working around the craggy areas, just picking out some different ones. You can see the salt's working already. A really nice effect, and even where I'm putting on paint, that will probably lift a little bit and will work quite nicely with the salt. So you just want a bit of both with the dark ones. I've just realised I've missed a bit of green, so I'm just going to come back in, just add a bit of green around these daisies. It's nice to have that soft base to work on later. And I'm just going to pop a bit more Payne's grey towards the bottom there. Okay, so I'm going to let that one dry naturally, because I want the salt to do its thing. Okay. Okay, so that's all dried off. Let's fold it. I've rubbed the salt off, and I've put a bit of gamboge into that green to make a lighter green now. And so I'm going to use my round number 6. So I'm going to start to come in and just create some extra foliage around these daisies. So just vary the pressure with the brush. It doesn't have to be too precise. Just start to bring them through where you've got this masking fluid. And then as you're coming lower here, it's more sort of leaf foliage shape, so I'm going to just bring and dotting a little bit with a brush, just starting to create this sort of long extended leaf shape. You want the paint to be nice and thick because it needs to cover over this grey. So that's working really nicely at the top. And do a little bit more down here. Start by getting some stems in. And work that brush across the stems, just varying the pressure. You start to get that flowing effect. And it's coming down into an area that's quite dark. So what I'll do is I'll just pick up a little bit of the Payne's grey towards the bottom, just bring that in. Bit of a rinse. Then I'm coming down and I'll come into this area the same. This lighter green is just giving it a bit more of a springish feel. And then I can do the same. Just bring some grasses in. So this is all, I'm doing all this from around number 6. You could go down to a smaller brush if you wanted. A bit more greenery along there. And come around this side again. Makes it easier. Okay, so what I've done is I've finished off these bits of grass just around here. The card cut out at the wrong point. And then I've come in with some little bits of Payne's grey. Everybody's will be different when it comes to this point. What you're looking at is you're looking at your photograph and looking where you might want to indicate a little bit more dark, and then you want to soften in some of those edges. So I still want to indicate a little bit more dark here. You can run along where you've indented the paper. You can take it elsewhere as well. It doesn't have to just be in the place you've indented. I'm going to pop a bit there and a bit there. Then I'm going to wet my brush. I'm just going to dab around that. You can dab just one side if you want a sharper edge, like it's quite nice to have a sharper edge there. I like that bit, so I don't want to put the water on there, but I'm going to dab above there so that I'm getting those hard and soft edges appearing. It's quite good for bits of shadow. I popped a bit of shadow here, a bit there. So I just want you to do a few little bits like that till you're happy, and then we're going to dry that off. Okay, so I've now got some clean water, and we're going to focus on the puffin itself, getting those nice colours in. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is get a little bit of colour on the white areas. So I'm going to come in, I'm using my round number 10 for water. It's not the end of the world if you come over the eye, but I'm going to try to avoid the eye. because that'll keep it nice and sharp for later. I'm using my round number 6 for colour. So the first thing that I'm going to do is pick up a tiny bit of this turquoise that I've had in the background. You can use the turquoise or the blue, just so I haven't got a pure white. Just a tiny bit in there. And then I'm going to pick up some grey. So I'm looking now at the shading that I can see. Don't be afraid to dab a little bit off on some kitchen towel from your brush, just so that you're controlling where that shading's going. Needs to be very little on your brush at this stage. And we're talking soft shading, we're not talking the hard shading. You can see where you've got more definition around the eye. This is just giving you the soft effect. If you go on and think, oh, that's a little bit too much, then a clean damp brush will just lift a bit of that off. I want the softness at the bottom. It's not quite as dark at the top there, so I'm just taking a little bit off. It's amazing the stuff isn't as white as you think. And then I'm going to come on to the front of the body. Again, start with a bit of that turquoise. Now this area is really white, so I want to make sure that I'm leaving that nice and light. I don't want the colour to run into there. And then pick up a bit of the grey again. I've dried my brush off. Up some little bits. I'm just breaking into where this dark's going to be as well, the dark colours later. And bringing that bit bottom of the leg, and that down the back of the leg there. Then just soften that in with a little bit of water on the leg there, and I'm going to soften in. So I'm with a damp brush, I'm touching these areas of grey, but missing areas. This is something called lost and found edges. That's just going to help fluff that edge up when it comes to it, when we're popping that on later. Take a little bit more grey on my brush. Just going to bring in just paint some grey where the darker areas will be on the webbed feet. So that's going to help define that when we come over with the orange later, without too much effort. Okay, I'm going to dry that one off. Okay, so I'm going to start to bring a little bit of the orange in now. So whatever orange you've made is what you need to use. I've got a tiny bit of water on the beak. You don't need a lot. You can come on neat if you want. Concentrate on getting a really nice edge. It's up to you if you want to leave these whiter lines or whether you want to just have a little indication. So I'm going to pop a little bit of one there. We could just have it just totally coloured. I actually think it could do with a little bit of rose or a bit of red, depending on what you've got. It would work with either. I think this orange is a little bit too orange. I'm just going to take a bit of rose in. To bold it up a bit. And then there's a little bit just on the face here. I'm going to use my round number 10 damp just to soften that edge in. So damp, I'm touching that edge, softening in. Don't want it to be too harsh. And then I'm going to bring some colour onto these feet. I'm hoping just to wash over and the grey underneath will just hold it together as a foot without me having to do too much shading, and just dampen that in at the top. And then the one behind just comes through. I don't want the feet to be too much of a focal point really, so taking that a bit low there, bit of tissue, just going to dab that one bit off. There. And then I'm coming into a bit of the grey. This is the mid grey, not the Payne's grey. Get this section in. Again, you can leave these really fine white lines if you want to. You could come on after and paint those on with a pen if you wanted to. The gel pens would work quite well. Just going to come across. Then I'm going to soften into that orange with that grey. I'm going to soften in this way. Just softening at the top there. I need something a dab of something a little bit darker just to come into this. I'm going to dab a little bit of the Payne's grey in. And I'm also going to dab a tiny bit of the orange in, just underneath. Then blend around a bit. going to bring a line along here towards the eye. A little bit more here. Clean damp brush, just soften that in, and again soften that in, just touching that edge. Okay, I'm going to dry that off. Okay, now I'm going to come in and do the eye now. I'm going to start with a little bit of the orange mix. Bring that in. Around there. And then I'm going to use the grey just to create a nice shape here. I don't want to lose all the orange, but I also don't want it to be orange. So I'm just doing it nice and carefully. If you can leave a tiny white dot, it always helps. I'm going to leave one tiny up there. The tinier the better. So they're running together, but I've controlled the running by not putting too much water on. In fact, I've gone on dry and hardly any water on the brush. What I'm doing now is just softening in that top edge. And if you do a tiny bit here, just touch that edge there, that would work really nicely. And then I'm just going to leave it a few seconds. This is where patience is a key. I've got some Payne's Grey ready on the brush. You want is to make sure that the sheen's going off. I'm going to start right near the white dot. I want it to run, but I don't want it to run up and out of the areas that I've softened. So I'm going to bring it in just to start to get that darker bit of the eye. So I'm concentrating on doing it around the white dot and just letting it blend a little bit, not a lot. Take a little bit of a darker down there. That's perfect. Okay, I'll dry that one off. Okay, so I'm going to wet the rest of the body now. I'm going to use my round number 10. So I want you to go bigger with your brush now to get this on. In all the area that's going to be, in effect, the dark black area. I'm going to start with a little bit of the orange mix. What you've got is some areas of lightness, and I'm going to pull it out with the orange. So I'm looking where there's a lighter area. I'm popping that on. You can also use a bit of blue in there, that will work quite nicely. I'm going to take a little bit of the turquoise in. What you want is tiny hints of this to show through, not too much though. Right, so I'm loading my brush up with the Payne's Grey now. I'm going to let it to start to flow. You want this to be really nice and bold, so you've got to be quite brave. Remember, it's only going to flow where you've wet it anyway. And it's not the end of the world if you lose all of those colours you've put in, so I don't want you to panic. It'll still work really nicely. if it was just Payne's grey, because that's got a hint of blue in anyway. So you're really loading your brush up. And letting it run. Do its thing. If you sort of follow the direction of the feathers, that will work quite nicely. And then at this point, rinse your brush really well, get it nice and damp, and we've just got to look at this edge. So I'm going to touch in places on this edge. So I'm wetting further than it needs to go, so they get that nice soft effect. But I've left some bits, I've not touched every single bit. With a damp brush you can move the paint around a little bit. So if there's an area that is not flowed well, then it's your chance to just blend it a bit. You've got to make sure that it's not wet though, that you're going in with a damp brush and it's not wet. Otherwise you'll get a big cauliflower. So at this point I'm just going to blend that through. I'm watching all the time how this is flowing. I can add a little bit more water. The tendency with Payne's grey is it flows to an edge and stops quite quickly. It's a bit of a shooting one. Okay, so I'm going to dry that one off. That'll stop it moving, then we'll put some definition in. Okay, so I've dried that off and I'm now coming in with a loaded brush with Payne's grey. So this is just about popping in a little bit of definition. So if I get this area in here darker, where I can see some shadow, then that wing is going to stand out much better, that side. Again, I can pop a little bit under here, and that's going to help that top wing stand out. So you don't necessarily even have to soften in, it's just about getting an extra little bit of colour on where there's a bit of shadow. I can take a little bit. The softening in is a tricky bit. Once you learn that, you've got a new depth to your pictures, but it's quite nice just to get these extra little bits on. For that depth and definition, I'm just going to soften a little bit at the top there. Just a little bit there. If you can leave this layer that you're doing now to dry naturally, that will really help. The trouble with Payne's grey is it does tend to fade quite a lot when you dry it with a hairdryer. I'm just going to take a little bit of darkness in there as well. Just soften that in a little bit, so it feels that that's a bit too light. Maybe just with the residue that's on the brush, just bring a bit down at the bottom so that I've got a bit of shadow. On this beak area, so it looks a bit too bright and standing out. Okay, so I'm going to rub the masking fluid off and then come back to you. Okay, so I've rubbed the masking fluid off, and what I'm doing now is just coming in and working a little bit into the daisies. So I've got some Gamboge yellow and I'm taking it on to dry, and I'm picking out some daisy heads. You can do as many of these as you want, but what you've got to be aware of is you've got to still have them wet to work with them. So it's one of those ones where you're not going to replicate the picture exactly, but you need to make sure you're getting a few daisy heads in so they look natural. You don't want them to just be one daisy head, one daisy head, one daisy head. You've got to blend them in as they're overlapping. Then I'm using the green that we've used on the foliage and just dotting a bit towards the bottom. Now, less on some, more on others. It doesn't matter, you just want a little bit in there. Then with a damp, clean brush, you're just going to pull, whilst it's still wet, out along each of these petals. So it's giving a little bit of shadow on one side of the petal. Some of the shadow will be yellow, some of the shadow will be green because you're pulling from a greener area. But you need this overlap. You can't have just one individual flower. It's got to feel like it's overlapping and there's more than one there. So it's a little bit making it up in places. Okay, so that's working really nicely. What I am going to do last of all, just so that it gives a little bit of a lift to the grass, is I've got some white gouache and I'm taking it into this yellowy green mix. So I want it to be a little bit more yellow than green. So where's my tester bit? So that little bit of white gouache is going to make sure that that is a bit more opaque, so that I can just lift some of this foliage a little bit so it stands out a bit more against the darkness of the rocks. And I want to do the same with the grass. Just be careful not to go over your flowers. You only need to do a tiny little bit really for it to hold together, but it's just gonna give it that little lift that it needs. It all seems a little bit dark around the bottom of the flowers. We don't want that. So I'm just dabbing in. Just to create some little bits of light on this foliage. And then it's this grassy area here that I want to really lift. Just giving it that little bit more definition in that area. Okay, that's worked really nicely. Hope you've enjoyed that one. I'll see you next week. Bye.